Welcome. This is James Corbett with your Global Research Feature Report from the Center for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. As the world focuses its attention on the siege of Tripoli in the NATO-led overthrow of the Libyan government, those very same Western powers who were responsible for the war crimes against the citizens of Libya are working behind the scenes to set the stage for yet another potential military intervention, this time with embattled Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The strategic value of Syria to the balance of power in the region is evident in Russia's recent warning that it would veto a proposed UN Security Council resolution imposing further sanctions on members of the Assad government. Syria is an important strategic ally of Russia, with the Russian Navy making use of the port of Latakia for access to the Mediterranean. Iran also counts Syria as a strategic partner in the so-called Shiite Crescent, providing Tehran with a vital connection to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Although predominantly Sunni, Syria is ruled by its Shiite minority and maintains close ties to Iran, where President Ahmadinejad has recently denounced imperialist aggression by NATO in Libya and Syria. Earlier this week, a new report from Amnesty International accused the Syrian government of the deaths of as many as 88 of the detainees from recent protests. The report, like almost all of the reportage on alleged government actions during the wave of violence, is based solely on second-hand accounts and contextless video snippets provided by the very opposition who are attempting to overthrow the Assad government. An establishment media eager for yet another war in the name of humanitarian intervention, however, is all too eager to overlook this point.
Amnesty International's report is called Deadly Detention, Deaths and Custody Amid Popular Protest in Syria. And we're joined by one of its authors, Neil Salmons, the Syria researcher for Amnesty International, just back from Syria. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Neil, lay out your findings and what you found in Syria.
Hi, good afternoon, Amy. Just a minor correction. I've not been into Syria. Amnesty International has not been allowed into the country during these events, although we have requested it. So the research to this report was done mostly from London, but also from some work in neighbouring countries and through communications with a large network of contacts and relatives of the families and other sources. So. About the report, as you said, yes, a terrible spike.
Despite the complete lack of substantiation of these claims, the establishment media is now once again rallying the public into a bloodletting mentality under the guise of the so-called responsibility to protect, a doctrine that allows marauding imperial armies to invade countries at will and commit war crime bombing campaigns against civilian populations under the guise of protecting those selfsame civilians. These calls for action echo previous calls by Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and other stalwarts of the American military-industrial political establishment to step up pressure on Assad and to keep military intervention on the table. In recent weeks, all of the leaders of the NATO bombing in Libya, including Obama, Sarkozy, Cameron, and Harper, have come out calling for Assad to step down, once again raising the specter of a Libya-like escalation of events by the Western powers. The possibility of military intervention in Syria is especially worrying because it is a potential powder keg threatening to set off a larger regional war that could even spark a confrontation between the NATO powers and China or Russia. Professor Michel Chossudovsky, director of the Center for Research on Globalization, has been writing a series of articles on the potential of military action in Syria to spark a World War III type scenario. Last week I talked to him about developments in the region and the possibility of military escalation amidst the current crisis.
We are certainly at a very dangerous crossroads because Western powers, the United States in particular, is putting pressure on the United Nations Security Council to come up with a strong resolution which would allow NATO to intervene militarily in Syria, using as a pretext the alleged atrocities committed by the government against peaceful protesters. Now, I think we have to understand that, first of all, whatever the nature of the Syrian government, any kind of military intervention under responsibility to protect is a derogation of the sovereign rights of a country, in this case Syria, by NATO, by the United States, and certainly neither NATO nor the United States have supported democracy throughout the world. In fact, they tend to support dictators. And we can look at the record of the United States supporting dictators in Indonesia, Latin America, and elsewhere. But the issue in the case of Syria, I think, is far more serious, and it's misunderstood by public opinion. First of all, from the outset of the so-called protest movement in mid-March of this year, in the border city of Dara, there was a confrontation between the police and the armed forces on the one hand, and well-armed death squads who were deployed in this small city of 45,000 inhabitants. There was not much of a protest movement. There was confrontation. Confrontation between an armed militia and the security forces of Syria. And this was confirmed by the early press reports. And in all the so-called opposition demonstrations, we have the presence of Islamist fighters, they're snipers, they're armed gangs, they are involved in acts of arson directed against government buildings. And in fact, right from the beginning, the first thing they did was to set fire to government buildings. In other words, acts of arson. The courthouse, the agricultural bank in Hama, various government buildings were targeted in acts of arson. So that essentially we have to set the records straight as far as what is actually happening on the ground. This is not a peaceful protest movement. There may be civilians who are supporting this, but it is an armed insurrection which is spreading from one city to another. We now have very firm evidence to the fact that both Turkey and Israel are supportive of these militia. In the case of Turkey, in fact, there have been declarations to the fact that they're supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. There are threats on the side of Turkey that they would intervene militarily inside Syrian territory. So we have a situation where NATO countries and Israel are covertly supporting an insurrection, as well as financing and providing weapons to this insurrection. And then at the same time, they are using this as a pretext to demonize the Syrian regime and demand the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad.
That the protest movement is not the spontaneous people's uprising that it is claimed to be in the establishment media is evident from reports demonstrating long-time US government support for opposition groups in the country and those seeking to destabilize the region. In April, US Secretary of State for Human Rights and Labor Michael Posner admitted an ongoing 2-year $50 million US government program to equip protesters with new technologies to help them evade detection and capture by their government, and admitted to organizing training sessions for activists from many of the Arab Spring countries, including Egypt and Syria, shortly before the Arab Spring began. Earlier this year, the Washington Post published leaked US diplomatic cables demonstrating that the US has been secretly funding the Syrian opposition since at least 2005 and continues to do so under the Obama administration. Why exactly an embattled and isolated government facing the prospect of a NATO-led invasion would be sending snipers to kill innocent civilians at the funerals of unarmed protesters has never been made clear by the anonymous, second-hand, unverified sources that are claiming this to be the case. Last year, however, a group called Gen Next, which has been involved with the Alliance of Youth Movements in organizing youth-led destabilization campaigns in countries that are not friendly to American and Israeli interests, delivered a training program in which participants were taught how to handle high-powered sniper rifles and shoulder-mounted grenade launchers. reports in Arabic media that the snipers in Syria are in fact being sent in from other countries in a false flag ruse to blame the violence on Assad have gone unreported in the West. Last month, Debka File reported that NATO headquarters and the Turkish High Command were drafting plans for the beginning of a military campaign in Syria which would involve arming the opposition with large quantities of anti-tank and anti-air rockets, mortars, and heavy machine guns. Now, some are worrying that should conflict arise, led by the same Western imperial interests that led the charge for Libya's oil and trumpeted by the same establishment media that praises every military campaign, the so-called responsibility to protect will henceforth be enshrined as a convenient tool for the globalist oligarchy to use whenever it is convenient to overthrow uncooperative governments. For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.